tomorrow. This edition of the WSDS marks 20 years of the platform, and it is a great privilege for us to be part of this event. Speakers and delegates have been able to join us for this important milestone edition. So thanks to everyone from our side. Your support is instrumental to, for the success of the platform and our efforts towards sustainable development. With this, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the thematic track titled "Is Decarbonization, Transport Sector Possible in India by 2050?" Focusing on the current state of play in the terms of energy usage, the strategies to decarbonize the transport sector, technologies available and emerging technologies to act as future catalysts in our effort towards net zero carbon emission from the transport sector. We have a privilege to have advisor Niti Aayog, Mr. Sudhendhu J Sinha, and we understand that Niti Aayog is also working on similar topic, and hopefully some of the points that we capture here will be useful for Niti Aayog in their deliberations and reports in the coming days that we see. With that, it is our privilege to welcome the moderator of the panel, Mr. Sudhendhu J Sinha. He is advisor at Niti Aayog, the apex think tank of the Government of India. He has experience of over 27 years in operations, infrastructure planning, coordination and management in the field and policy making levels at different segments and sectors of transportation. I'm also grateful to have distinguished panelists with us for the session. Professor Geetam Tiwari. She is MOUD Chair Professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at ANTRIP, IIT Delhi. She has worked with city, state, and central governments across in India and on the topic of public transport, road safety projects. She has over 100 publications in peer-reviewed journals and has co-edited several books on transport planning and safety. We are fortunate to have Mr. Clay Stranger, who is the Managing Director at RMI and leads the India program. He is the lead author of over a dozen articles and reports on India's clean energy opportunity. He also advises the governments, both at the state and central level, on clean energy policy and technology solutions. Last but not the least, we have Mr. Vivek Chandran, who leads the transport program at Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation. He provides strategic planning, leadership, and guidance to the transport program and its portfolio of projects. Moving on, we have a context-setting presentation from my side, and which will put up some data points in terms of how, and where we are in terms of energy consumption from the transport sector, as well as what are the possible technology solutions that we can see, which would help the discussions to happen in the session. Post this presentation, we will have a short video and a launch of a report that we have been working on towards sustainable freight initiatives in India, state of play, following which we'll have the panel discussion. We also encourage you, all the audience, to post questions related to the topic for our speakers to answer. With that, I'll just have 5-6 slides to set the context, and then we'll move on with the session. Now, while we are talking about India transport sector, in terms of fuel consumption, more than 90% of the energy that is coming and used by the transport sector is accounted by the conventional fuel, primarily diesel and gasoline. We have a small share of natural gas. Electricity also is making up in terms of its share. The data is for 2017, which means that most of the electricity demand is accounted for the railways, which is the largest kind of a transportation sector using electricity for its movement. Also, if we look at the different vehicle segments in the transport sector, primarily road transport, we have heavy commercial vehicles and light commercial vehicles accounting for the major share in the diesel consumption. In terms of the gasoline consumption, again, two-wheelers and cars account for the majority share in that. With regard to the modal shift, this chart basically shows how the share of railways has been declining over the years and how share of road transport has been increasing over the years. while we are talking about net zero emissions from the railway sector, which the target is for 2030, we should also keep in mind that, with the declining share, the net gain for the economy and the environment in terms of moving goods and passengers from the rail sector, it makes more sense to have larger share of railways uh, in coordinated with efforts towards net zero emissions from the railway side. Moving on from the transportation sector, we all understand that there are different strategies to decarbonize the transport sector. We have the modal shift, which through our analytical analysis, we know that modal shift has the largest potential of decarbonizing the transport sector, but is also one of the costly and time-consuming activity or strategy to kind of decarbonize the transport sector. There are other alternative fuels that are available that in terms of electric vehicles. Also, hydrogen is being discussed, and we'll hear more in the discussion following this. We have the fuels efficiency, improving fuel efficiency strategy, and also in terms of demand reduction that we kind of went through during the COVID time, where we were all working from home, and how reduced oil consumption happened because of the reduced transport demand. Moving on, this is a chart basically showing what are the alternative fuel technologies right now available in different passenger and freight sectors. We have a whole array of fuel technologies, low carbon to zero carbon, from biofuels to battery electric to a cantilever traction-based system that is emerging right now in the freight segment, particularly in the European countries, as well as in the US. However, we'll see what India will be facing in terms of how we move ahead with the decarbonization strategy. With that, we have the key topics of discussion that will follow in the panel discussion. There are two major sets of topics that we have chosen for this discussion, where the speakers will be focusing on. This first one is in terms of no regret infrastructure approach, where we have low and zero carbon technologies options available today that have high scale-up potential for different modes of transport, including road, rail, air, and waterways. Focus on infrastructure creation for non-motorized and public transport systems. The second bucket is in terms of incentivizing zero carbon transport, alignment of existing policies, schemes, and programs towards decarbonizing the transport sector. And the second topic under it is segment-wise avenues of investment for the central and state governments to push sustainable modes of transportation. I'll now ask my backup team to kind of play the video on the report launch titled Sustainable Freight Initiatives in the Freight Sector, and the state of play that we have right now. Sorry for the glitch. So I now hand it over to Mr. Sinha for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharif. Now, I take mobility as one of the most fundamental expressions and transport as an enabler. And before such a formidable panelist, of course, there will be a lot of collaborative learning that one expects. The context has been set, the topics have been announced. Now let's see what are the views. Is a decarbonized transport sector possible in India by 2050? That is the most fundamental issue, and how to go about it, what policy requirements could be there, what technology is required, what the entire ecosystem ought to be there so that we are able to achieve it at the earliest. Now, to start with, I'll first ask Professor Geetam Tiwari. She has got fabulous experience with urban planning and transport planning. Yes, ma'am, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kumar, and thank you, Sharif and Terry team, for inviting me to this panel discussion. Sharif, yes. So I would just walk you through these few slides to answer this question, decarbonizing passenger and freight transport in India. Sharif, could you please put it on a presentation mode? I have to put it, okay? Yeah. Sharif is showing it so he can put it on a presentation mode.
Let me try
Anyway,
again.
I
I'm
can
sorry.
continue
Yeah.
talking. So first important thing I would like to flag that, when we start doing these kind of scenarios and estimates, the next slide, please. The next slide. Should I can also show it from my screen. Will that be? Yeah, that is fine. That is fine. Please go to the next slide now. Yes. So we start with this when we are doing these kind of estimates and scenario building. So I looked at this NTDPC report. If you recall, this was published in 2014 and a lot of details went into it. So these were the GDP growth estimates that were assumed in that report. It was only up to 32, not 2050. But only thing I wanted to flag is that even in these kind of estimates, there are a lot of uncertainties. And as we know that now we have not experienced this GDP growth rates at all. So how that plays to our travel demand, we will have to revisit many of the numbers. Next slide, please, Sharif. Yes, so now Gupta and Garg have published, Professor Amit Garg from IIM has published a paper in 2020 where actually they start building scenarios and they start with this growth in passenger and freight traffic. And this is, I think, something we have to just notice here that if you look at the change between 11-12 to 17-18, and this is when we have already declared that we want to become carbon neutral, etc. Actually, in both in freight, which is shown by the line graph, and in passenger, which is shown by these bar charts, you find that the modal shift has really not happened. It is kind of static. So we, after making a lot of announcements, actually, I think we still have a lot of challenges to achieve that. Next one, please. Okay, so in that report said in 2032, the aim to attain for freight is 50% market share in interregional freight traffic, which will be increasing from 33%, which was observed in 12-13. So we know that we have not achieved this. And of course, for this, a lot of assumptions were done that how we were going to do. We were going to upgrade our select corridors for high-speed trains. And we were also looking at shift of focus to for passenger, looking at long distance and intercity transport and suburban corridors for dense passenger traffic to achieve higher rail share, which as Sharif mentioned is more energy efficient. But so far, I think our attempts have been weak towards this strategy. Next one, please. Yes, so now if I just look at NTDPC or what kinds of things that Professor Garg has also brought out in his paper, freight, we want to have 50% share in 32. So in 2050, then we will see what are the requirements. How are we going to achieve it? It is not just about high-speed corridors. If we start analyzing these aspects in detail, I think to me, two important issues which we have to address very carefully is intermodality. Certain value-added goods will continue to move on roads, but long distance, if we have to shift to rail, how does this, you can say, seamless transfer happens, which is more reliable? So I think we still haven't, even after having dedicated freight corridors. What about intermodality? How a truck container is going to move to a train container? That part has to be looked very carefully. And then, of course, obvious thing is last mile delivery. And especially in urban areas, we have seen that last mile delivery is already by very low carbon modes, which is mostly or non-motorized transport. Are we going to retain that? What is our strategy? Because even if we shift to electric LCVs, how does that compare with NMT? So these are the questions we have to ask ourselves. Now, passenger traffic, NTDPC also said it's going to increase by a factor of 16 to 20 times as compared to 12, 13. But, and of course, our ambition is to increase public transport share, which is buses and rail-based public transport. But the question is how? Because we have, if you see the trend again from 12, 13, when we made all these declarations or ambitions, and if we are in 21 now, the trend is not in that direction at all. In fact, we have been reducing public transport share and increasing motorized private transport. So I think there is a lot of work to be done between the policy announcements and what happens on the ground. As far as walking and bicycle trips are concerned, which is mostly the lowest carbon transport trips, I would still not call them absolutely zero carbon, and I'll explain why. So we do have high shares of this definitely in passenger transport and in urban areas. But the trend is not so happy because the trend is reducing. And even if we are able to stabilize these trends by doing a lot of effort, again, the question is how? Because we have got all kinds of announcements, smart city missions. Now, MO, Ministry of Urban Affairs and Housing has been announcing all kinds of projects. But to see something actually happening on the ground is yet, we have not found that result at all. And we still continue to see there is large gap between what we want to achieve through policy announcements and what is actually happening and where the investments are going. So this is, even if we are able to stabilize it, I think we will be in a very happy situation because we have a large share already of walking and bicycle trips. So it's not asking people who are using cars to shift to walking and bicycling. Of course, that would be beneficial for their health, but okay, let's leave that aside right now. Let's only focus on decarbonizing transport. And the other aspect for public transport would be whether it's metro or bus. The last mile connectivity again plays a very important role, which is basically your walking and NMT infrastructure. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now I present this graph is presented by Professor Amit Garg in his paper, and he's looked at different scenarios. So what I just wanted to point out, of course, if you look at first from business as usual, 2030, what happens, and compare it with different scenarios, and I would just focus on CNT, which is carbon neutral transport scenario. So huge benefit, right? Huge reduction. And where is the reduction coming from? If you see the green color is for road freight, and gray is for air, passenger air. These two uh, these two sectors are showing us huge benefit if we are able to do carbon neutral scenario. And then 2050 also, if you see, if we do not do anything, then of course all emissions are huge, almost 900 million tons. But if you are able to do carbon neutral scenario, it is even better than 2030. So this looks very optimistic, and your answer to your question will be yes, of course, if not zero, we can coming close to it. But let's get to the next slide, please. So here are the assumptions that is behind this carbon neutral scenario, and this is where we have to ponder because it's kind of backcasting. If we can actually address these assumptions, if we can materialize these assumptions, probably it is possible. So first big assumption is large modal shifts more than what NTDPC has assumed. So if you recall, NTDPC assumed 50% share for rail and for road for freight. And in this scenario, it is higher for rail than 50%. So the question is, if up to 17, 18, we haven't seen any reduction in road or increase in rail, how is it going to happen? Of course, the other major assumption here is that major source of electricity is fossil fuels. And I'm sure you'll have more discussion on this, that how we are going to clean our electricity source, because a lot depends on that. Uh, I think the one I really want to highlight is this reduction in transport demand, which is basically looking at motorized passenger demand as well, because that is what you can think can reduce. So it goes back to, retaining modal, what kind of modal shares we are going to observe. Are we able to retain our NMT, non-motorized transport and public transport trips? And the question is how, because so far our efforts don't seem to give us good results. Of course, the other big assumption in this is dedicated freight corridors have been assumed in all routes, all main routes, which we have to see if we are going to get by 2050. They have assumed a lot of technological change, high-speed rails, all kinds of interesting technologies for freight trains also. And one of the other assumption there is, of course, that where is all this revenue going to come from to help achieve this carbon neutral scenario? And one of the big assumption there is petrol and diesel cess is transferred to railways for development and maintenance. Now, if you recall, this petrol and diesel cess originally was set to help highway programs. And then we had made a case in 12th plan document to get some funds for reinforcing urban public transport. That has not happened. In fact, you know that in 2018, this has been merged with the general budget. So actually this cess is funding many other development programs also. Next one, please. Okay, so quickly I will start wrapping it up and just want to highlight two things. We are talking about carbon neutrality, but we keep focusing on only carbon neutral during operations. And you know that carbon is very important during the whole life cycle of a project or a transport system that we are looking at. So if you look at road transport system, we are getting carbon from vehicle operation when the vehicle fleet is being manufactured, maintained, and it will be eventually disposed of. But we are also doing road infrastructure and infrastructure construction process, infrastructure operation and maintenance, and disposal. Each of these aspects are producing GHGs. So if we are looking at total carbon, decarbonizing transport, we have to address, right now we keep talking about one aspect. All these aspects have to be addressed. Next, please. And for road transport, we are let's look at buses, operation of buses. So we can look at different types of fuels, but then vehicle manufacturing processes, vehicle maintenance processes, and disposal. And similarly in road infrastructure, a construction process, the materials we are going to use, road maintenance and road disposal. cement versus concrete debate, a cement versus bitumen debate. So all these things, aspects have to be addressed. Next, please. Similarly, if you look at rail sector and let's say metro or any rail, so we again keep focusing only on metro operation, which is electrified. And if we clean the electricity, a lot of it is addressed at the operation part only. What about fleet? And same thing, coach manufacturing, maintenance and disposal. And when we are constructing the rail infrastructure, we are making underground construction. That itself is very carbon intensive process because we are using underground construction, cement, infrastructure construction, operation maintenance and disposal. All this is going again to involve carbon emissions. Next, please. So here are the details for metro train also. You need all these aspects to be addressed. Next, please. Okay, so before I close this, I just wanted to highlight. So we had done this detailed study comparing a CNG run bus and metro in Delhi. So only two numbers I wanted to highlight for today's discussion. So for CNG bus, we find that if we calculate CO2 equivalent per passenger kilometer in Delhi, it is 10.20. And if we look at metro system, it is 18.7. So per passenger for metro, it works out higher. And of course, you can guess the reason because metro is electricity and electricity right now is coal-based. But the other important aspect you see, 49% of GHG, both for buses and for metro, is only 49% is from operations. Remaining 51% is in the other aspects. So that means if we are talking about decarbonizing, so far we have not discussed that 51% aspect at all. Next, please. Yes, this is also actually addressing the same thing. So here you can see that how much is it coming from during operations and how much is coming from non-operations. And this ratio we have to understand. So I just wanted to highlight this. If we are talking about decarbonizing, we will have to make a roadmap for all the aspects. And then, of course, we have to figure out where is it that we are going to get the benefits very quickly, what is doable. And of course, as Sharif highlighted in the beginning, the last slide, please. Next one. Yeah, so I think for our decarbonization transport preparedness, we have to look at non-operation activities, which is infrastructure construction, vehicle manufacturing and maintenance. And of course, for operational activities, we have not been very successful even in retaining our current modal shares for non-motorized transport and for public transport. So that is what we will have to work harder because sometimes I feel that we have been making a lot of announcements, but actually for implementation, our stakeholders and decision makers and even experts are not ready to accept it. So we have a huge challenge if we really want to decarbonize. I would say even by 2050, we have to do some backcasting and make a roadmap for each aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So you have covered all aspects of. So you have covered all of how to decarbonize our public transport and the entire transport infrastructure. And yes, you mentioned about shared mobility, you mentioned about non-motorized transport, you mentioned about last mile connectivity, and you did also say that a lot of challenges are there for the policymakers as well as for those who are into the implementation and in the execution of those policies. Yes. Now over to you, Clay. Your initiatives, the way you are working for the clean transport. Yes, Clay. Over to you, Clay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sinha. Thank you, Geeta ma'am. Vivek, great to see you all here. The sun is rising over here in Colorado, and I'm really happy to be with you all today. I am not going to share any slides. I'm just going to share a few thoughts, and then I look forward to the discussion. The theme today is whether India can decarbonize transport by 2050. But as I was reflecting and preparing for the panel, I thought inverting the question and considering what must be done to decarbonize the transport sector by 2050, if we ask that question, we might get to a different answer. And Geetam ma'am spoke a lot, I think, about NMT, about public transport. And as a transportation researcher, I often think, and many of our peers often think, about reducing activity, shifting activity, and then cleaning the remaining activity. I'm going to focus today particularly on the cleaning activity side of motorized transport. And the reality is, I think the technology has moved faster than anyone expected, myself included, over the last 5 to 10 years. So there is some logic, I think, behind concentrating a lot of effort on that final step, cleaning activity. And in this case, I'm talking about the shift to zero emission vehicles. So today I want to touch on 4 topics briefly. And I hope that these 4 topics will offer some hope in response to the prompt of the session. And those 4 topics are on passenger transport, freight transport, on batteries, and on finance. And so let me start with passenger. The focus of Government of India on electric vehicles through the likes of FAME2, the National Mission on Transformative Mobility, and other programs are yielding really impressive results. But even without incentives and at the same interest rate as internal combustion engines vehicles receive, we're seeing that electric taxis that are plying more than 160 kilometers per day will achieve cost parity with diesel vehicles and petrol cars by the end of this year. That's really encouraging news, but in India, total cost of ownership parity is not the only threshold that matters. It's cost, capex or purchase price that also matters. And that's why central programs and state level programs are really critical, and why we're not at a place yet where the market can simply take over. But we are getting there, we're getting closer. Another thing that caused me a lot of hope in the passenger sector was I learned recently that since the Delhi EV policy launched several months ago, over 100 models of 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, and 4-wheelers have applied for incentives through the Delhi policy. And I think one of the great barriers that we'd all heard about over the last several years was a lack of supply or a lack of diversity of models. I think that we are finally crossing the threshold where that is no longer a persistent barrier. Let me turn now to the freight sector, where rising demand for goods and services in the country has supported the economy, but it's also driven tremendous growth in freight activity, which has led to, unsurprisingly, led to increased oil consumption and carbon emissions. Electrifying trucks and delivery vehicles in India could alleviate this. And according to RMI's model, $97 billion in annual oil imports and 7 gigatons cumulatively of carbon emissions could be saved between now and 2050 if India embarks on a freight electrification pathway. That 7 gigatons is the largest, or one of the largest, decarbonization opportunities in the transportation sector globally that we've identified. But in order to achieve these savings, sales will need to grow substantially over the next decade. If we look at trucks, for example, final mile delivery vehicles may be ahead, LDVs, but MDVs and HDVs would need to grow from a base of almost 0 today to close to 25% by 2030 in order to be on track to realize the 2050 savings that I just described. One of the things that we're committed to, and we're working with many partners here today to make true, is the launch of a couple of electric trucking freight corridors in India. I think the composition of India's freight road movement, with I think 50% of activity concentrated on 6 or 7 corridors, makes it an ideal setting to actually pilot and demonstrate the technology in the country and to launch a couple of electric freight corridors in the near term. The third thing I want to briefly touch on, as I mentioned, is battery technology. And in November of last year, I'm sure many on the line today know that the National Program on Advanced Chemistry Cell Battery Storage was approved, with a really significant outlay of a little more than 18,000 crore, which is equivalent to 2.5 billion US dollars over a 5-year period. So, Mr. Sinha, I commend your work and Niti's work in making this happen. And to some, I think the outlay of 18 crore may seem very large, but from our perspective, it's the magnitude that's required to have the catalytic effect on the market that it's intended to have. And in doing so, can really bring long-term economic value to India. For example, like our estimates suggest that even on a conservative scenario where Siam and others have signaled a realistic target of about 30% EV sales by 2030, we estimate that would result in a cumulative market size of batteries for $48 billion. So hence the allocation that's being given through the battery program would have about 20-fold leverage or 20 times leverage over the cumulative market value. That's exactly, from our perspective, what funds like this are intended to do. They're intended to multiply in their impact. And in this case, we see an opportunity for 20x multiplication of impact. So the last thing I want to touch on is on finance. I know it's been a hot topic recently, and I think that it can play a huge role in unlocking the EV transition in India and globally. And so if you are looking to buy an electric vehicle, either for your business or for your own personal use, you may be surprised to find that in India, the interest rate on the loan for that vehicle will be substantially higher than an interest rate for a diesel or petrol-powered vehicle. You're also maybe asked for a larger down payment for the vehicle. And why is this? And as we looked into it, risk is the main cause for these financing challenges. An EV is considered a riskier class to finance than an internal combustion engine in India. EVs face a range of risks that can be categorized as either asset risk or business model risk. If we look at asset risk, it's the risk that's associated with the financing of the vehicle. It includes risks related to technology, policy, manufacturing, and resale of the vehicle. And if we look at business model risk, it's the risk that's associated with the use of the vehicle. And it includes risks related to the customer profile, expected utilization, and operations and maintenance. So as a result of these risks, banks and non-banking financial companies in India are not only requesting higher interest rates for EVs, but they're also financing a smaller share of the vehicle's value, hence the higher down payment. Also, there are fewer specialized loan products for EVs, and insurance rates can be higher in most cases. So according to a report that we recently developed with Niti Aayog, over the next decade, India's EV transition is going to require a cumulative capital investment of about 19 lakh crore, or 266 billion US dollars, in vehicles, charging infrastructure, and batteries. And in order to enable that by 2030, our analysis indicates that the market size for financing EVs in India has the potential to be as large as almost 4 lakh crore, about 50 billion US dollars. So considering the future capital and financing requirements for India's EV transition, we need to start developing a toolkit that can address some of the barriers I described. The report takes a look at a number. There's 3 that I'll briefly touch on today that I think could be really impactful. The first is priority sector lending. And the Reserve Bank of India requires 40% of net bank credit to be deployed towards priority sectors. We would recommend the inclusion of EVs in PSL guidelines in order to incentivize banks to increase lending towards the sector. The second is interest rate subvention. And subventions can act as a subsidy on commercially offered interest rates, with a government or another entity bearing the balance through associated banks. And such schemes would substantially improve the affordability of EV loans and would have a huge impact, and they're already doing so at the state level in Delhi. And lastly, product guarantees and warranties are not in place for EVs, and OEMs need to provide assurances in the form of guarantees both to financial institutions and warranties to buyers on the performance of their products. This is going to be required in order to help manage the risk of financing an EV. So these solutions will help lower the cost of the capital transition for EVs and for consumers, and they'll increase the quantum of finance available for EVs in the country. So if diligently applied, I believe they can help give us confidence to the answer to the question, is a decarbonized transport sector possible in India by 2050? The answer being yes. So thank you all very much for the chance to share a few thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Clay. You have in fact touched upon all the aspects of EV and yes, ending with yes. So we started with the kind of, initially it is doable, but I would say that Geeta ma'am had a lot of doubts, whether I would put it that she had wanted to place a lot of alerts to us. And yes, you ended up with yes. And now over to you, Vivek. Yes.
Thank you, Sinha sir. Hope I'm audible. It's great to be on the panel. Professor Geeta, Clay, nice to be here. I think I have the difficult job of kind of straddling both the arguments. Perhaps I'll try and take a middle ground. So yes, I do think decarbonization is a possibility. But yes, there's a lot of work to be done as well. A lot of policy support will be required. And I think that's essentially the point that Geeta ma'am was also kind of raising, that there are challenges and how do we overcome them. One way of looking at this, and I think to an extent Clay alluded to this, is that there are various aspects to decarbonizing transport and for India. And the necessity, the absolute necessity without which we cannot decarbonize is the fact that we need to clean up the transport sector. It needs to be clean technologies, zero emission technologies, and hence electric is certainly important. And it's also a hopeful situation that we're in. It's not that there's more reason to be skeptical. One, because when we look at the electricity sector and recent developments in it, we are seeing great trends towards the incorporation of solar and of late even solar with battery technology. With prices crashing to 1.9 rupees a unit, it's just the cheapest power source we have right now. And we've also been deploying it consistently as in large numbers in India. So there is reason to hope that by 2050, we would certainly have figured it out. And we also have the ambition for 450 as an interim gigawatt hour, 450 gigawatt hours as an interim target, which will set us up for it. So on the power side, there is definitely reason to be hopeful. The second trend that is extremely important that has occurred is the electric vehicles and the emergence of electric vehicles themselves and the way they have emerged. We have battery prices hovering around $100 mark. In the next few years, it is expected to hit that. And in certain chemistries, it may already have hit that. And this has happened not out of the blue. It has happened through policy support, through policies in China, policies in Europe, where the impetus for battery manufacturing, for electric vehicle manufacturing has occurred. California as well was an early starter at this. So policies can drive prices, can drive technology growth and make things economical. And that's an important factor for us because when we look at some of the barriers going forward, when we project barriers, as to what may be the challenges we'll face in decarbonization, it's essentially that what will be competitive in terms of technology and prices that we will adopt it. And in that, we need to adopt several strategies. One of them being to use, for example, the railways. Sharif alluded to that. Long haul is going to be one of the challenges. There's certainly it is right now seen that road transport is occupying the space that of carrying freight in the country. But then can the Indian Railways step back in with increased capacities? There is already ways in which the freight capacity is being increased by looking at DFCs, of course, but also faster trains. And let's not forget that a large portion of what freight the rail carries right now is actually coal. And hopefully, when that whole trajectory of fuel cleanup happens on the power side, the coal is going to open up some amount of freight that the railways can carry. And it could always move into higher value commodities and, in fact, make more money for the railways as well as a process. So there are, again, ways of tackling it. Definitely, we need to increase capacity. We need to increase its capability of handling freight more efficiently. There is really a lack of infrastructure because coal is not the same as containers. There's plenty of work to be done on that. And in addition to that is urban planning and regional urban planning that will also need to be looked at. Because where are our new industries coming up? Where are they being located? And how is, to an extent, on urban planning itself, when we look at cities itself and how they are being engineered, I think that entire area of work needs to be looked at because our cities are yet to be built. I mean, we are going to almost double the population in urban areas by 2050. Roughly, we will be 50% urbanized, close to 50% urbanized at least. And that means we need to focus on our urban growth. Where these urban populations end up concentrating, where these activities get concentrated is going to be extremely important. And then their relationship to these cleaner modes will start emerging and become clearer and become controllable to an extent, considering these investments. So I think in that sense, we need to also look into the fact that, well, improve measures are a requirement in the avoid, shift, improve kind of the three-step approach. Improve is a no, we have no choice but to improve, right? But when we look at the avoid and shift aspects, that's where a lot of the developmental goals as well kind of merge. And there's simply lots to gain from the investments there. And they are a fail-safe to reduce demand eventually from the transport sector. So I think just concurring to what Professor Geetam had put in her slides, I think we need to start focusing on some of these challenges immediately because while there are synergies, for example, public transport electrification, bus electrification in urban areas can become to an extent, are the first electric vehicles that are getting electrified, and hence urban will be the front runners. The next 10 years, 15 years, it's going to be urban areas where we see most of the electrification occur, and then that would be the stepping stone for long haul freight as well as other forms of long distance electrification. So, yep, I think that's it from me.
Okay, thank you, Vivek. So we have got three spectrums now available before us. Okay, now let me start my question. And this time I'll take and it will be reverse round, starting from Vivek only. Do you think that the technology, cutting edge technology at an affordable price is available right now with us? Yes, no?
So if you're alluding to electric vehicles, it's certainly available. Globally, it is. In India, it is yet to mature. So I think the more we purchase it, the more we create situations where the value localization of the value chains can occur, the more practical it'll become. Because I think that's essentially the barrier that we have, that we need to create more demand so that there is and supply at the same time, so that these value chains localize themselves. The moment we do that, we'll have a lot of those prices becoming at least close to what it is globally, and then we can start adopting them in more numbers. So it's almost like a positive cycle that gets reinforced.
So I take it as yes, with a little bit with a few riders, right? Over to you, Clay. Cutting edge technology at an affordable price. Available, not available?
I would say for early moving market segments, available. For other segments that are a little bit more difficult, approaching the threshold and soon to be affordable.
Okay, that's a qualified answer. Yes, ma'am. Over to you.
Yeah, I think for the two most important sectors, buses, right now it is not affordable when we compare it to other technology for buses. And for freight, that is also one of the most important sectors for decarbonization. No, the answer is no, we don't have that technology right now.
Okay, now I'll ask, my question is addressed to you, ma'am, this time. Then what is holding us? Say, if I were to ask you to identify one or two points, challenges that is holding us from achieving this, or rather moving ahead on a fast pace on this decarbonize initiative, what are those two?
So let me divide into two parts my answer. First is the technology that you asked, and I think for that answer Vivek gave, that as the demand grows, we should be able to have it in affordable prices. But if you look at, especially if you look at the sector for public transport, individuals are not going to buy buses. Governments have to buy it, either municipality or state government. So unless there is a strong support from the government, only then it's going to happen. My second part of the answer is that it is not just about vehicles. If we want to make the public transport decarbonized, we have to look at the process, the whole system of public transport. If my electric bus gets stuck in congestion, I am not going to use bus. So that part also has to be very, very strong. Otherwise, this very optimistic modal shifts that we assume for 2030 and 2050 is not going to happen. So we can have lots of EV cars and electric two-wheelers, and we still miss out our targets.
No, ma'am, I think you have to be a little more clear. What exactly is holding us from achieving it or moving ahead fast?
Yeah, I think for the second, so the first part is the market. The market has to be created by the government. So government has to show more seriousness about it, and not just keep talking about public-private partnerships, or even if it is public-private partnerships, it has to be very strong government commitment. Second part is that I think again the infrastructure is done by government, and I still don't see happening. So what is holding us? I don't think we are really serious about public transport right now. Because the moment we talk about NMT and PT, we have lots of ifs and buts why it cannot be done.
Okay, so
we are not ready for it.
We have to be more serious about this issue. Yes, Clay.
Yeah, commitment from governments. Yeah.
Right, ma'am. Yes, over to you, Clay. What is holding us?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the cost of capital in India. And if you look at consumers, right? Like if you look at individual consumers, the inability to make a decision based on total cost of ownership as opposed to capital cost or purchase price is that's a difficult difference. Therefore, if we look at corporations or companies, or in some cases even government, where bigger balance sheets exist, that's where I think movement needs to really happen first. I think that we need to look to companies, actually, we need to look to the private sector to lead for fleets and assets that they control so that we can achieve the economies of scale that Vivek was describing and actually be to a place where purchase price becomes comparable. Like those benefits of total cost of ownership are real. They will save actual money in people's pockets over the lifetime of the investment, but those savings are unable to be unlocked right now, in some cases because of the high cost of capital.
Yes, that is well taken. So you completely emphasized on the finance aspect. Now, if I could ask Vivek, which one will you say as the low-hanging fruit if we decide to take on this decarbonizing initiative? What would be the low-hanging fruit? When I say low-hanging, that means that it must take least cost, least gestation, and easily achievable. There are no ifs and buts.
So perhaps there are a few answers to that depending on which part of the system, the transport system we look at. With electric, for example, and electrifying our private vehicles, it is perhaps not the easiest. But if we were to start looking at what, to an extent, government controls, let's start with those. Public transport, buses, there are plenty of them. And we need to even produce and supply plenty of them for just the reasons that we need mobility in our cities, right? And we need to provide people a way of going to where their destinations are. And for that very same reason, we need to invest money anyways. We were just looking at some assessments of how many buses we need in our country right now. Just looking at the fact that if we had 50 buses per lakh population, we need about 200,000 buses as is. And we are just halfway there, right? And this is just in urban India, and we're not looking at interurban even. Imagine those buses in future were electrified, and those will also, it will grow in future, but imagine those were just electrified. The amount of batteries that would be required to just to produce for those buses is enough to create and generate an industry to supply batteries. Right, so I think that's where we'll have to look at it. How do we leverage what we can control? And government, like ma'am said, and even Faye was saying, we need to use what policies we have to enable investment. And this is essentially a simple strategy that we could look at fleets that are governable by government to start with. And then look at fleets that are commercially running, which are already viable. Cabs are already, like lithium is a great example where cabs are already running and they're running in profit. As long as they can do the kilometers, they are viable. So here are two examples where it works as is, it works right now. Let's start looking at the railways. I think when you're looking at long haul, railways is extremely important. We're already en route to electrifying railways. There's a great ambition to electrify it by 2024. And we seem to be on track, at least this year, that about 5,000 kilometers was electrified, which is as per plan. And so electrifying the railways is an important first step for decarbonizing transport and strengthening it further on. So again, there's viability in that. It can be done right away. There's no question about it. The third piece is on planning, because it's an important activity, but the only problem is we haven't gotten it right. It is not a very expensive activity. It is an activity that can be done quite easily with the kind of expertise that is required, with the right kind of tools being deployed. It can be done. But unfortunately, we have just we've just kind of failed to plan our cities in the last 10 to 20 years. It just seems like that the entire process has fallen apart. And so reviving, making sure that some of the best practices are implemented and government again, this is completely under government's control. can kind of stimulate urban planning and regional planning yet again. I think that would be important. So yeah, there's lots that we can do with government policy and use it as leverage to ensure we get there.
So finally, it boils down to government policy only, right? Yes, ma'am. I have a question to you. Now, this is different from policy and all those things. Suppose we go ahead with the decarbonizing transport sector. What implications will it have on, say, employment?
Yes, this question is a little tricky question because there are a lot of discussions on this, that if you move from IC engines to all electric, it has a huge implication on employment because our industry is so heavily dependent on IC engines right now. So my answer would be yes, we will, if, it may have a negative impact. However, we can plan a roadmap. Obviously, it's not going to happen tomorrow. So we can start preparing for that diversification and how we minimize this as much as possible. It would require some reskilling of many of our labor force and expertise. But I think if we are looking at 2050, probably it's possible. So the first part of the answer is yes, it may have a negative impact on this thing, but let's look at look at the complete chain, whether we talk about freight transport or passenger transport. If we start looking at how we manage it. So to manage efficiently, we need a different skill. Let's not focus only on manufacturing sector. So I think that would be my take. I think, as you know, in these kind of situations, we need to do backcasting, and I think we can have a roadmap which is not very negative.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. In fact, you believe me, all our initiatives are aimed at ensuring that the localization element, where, of course, the Atmanirbhar Bharat or the kind of, the grand vision that we have for employment, that is always protected, We do not come to a situation where we initiate one, we achieve one area, and on the other hand, we have loss of the another. Yes, Clay, you have got better understanding of the system. Please tell me. Implications on employment. Can you say something on that?
It's a hotly debated topic. I think it's honestly one that incumbent industries probably use at their disposal to argue why this transition should not happen. A study was done for Europe, and it's obviously a different market, but a study was done by Cambridge Econometrics for the European transition to EVs, and they found actually a net gain in employment over a decade, although not all of the jobs were proportional or symmetrical. And so that is a challenge I think that Professor Geetam is talking to. It has to be planned, there has to be a skilling program, but on balance and over time, at least in the European context, it's a net gain. I see in a service-heavy sector or a service-heavy geography like India, no reason why it couldn't be even higher in terms of its net gain as you start to think about charging infrastructure operators rather than self-operated charging infrastructure, for example.
Yes, over to you, Vivek, on this issue.
Yeah, actually, we did a study on this with our partner CEW just recently, and there are some numbers that comes out of it. Of course, we're still trying to make these numbers better because there's a lot of ground fruiting in terms of the jobs intensity on each of these sectors that needs to be understood better. But I think the numbers are quite fascinating because we do need to look at it from a larger economic point of view. I think Clay made that point very clearly. It's not ICE versus EV, because I think common knowledge says that the intensity of jobs in EVs, just the manufacturing of it, is lesser. But that is not to say that it will not change for ICE either, because as automation of processes increase, there will be the intensity of jobs would reduce there. But having said that, if we were to just look at the chain of events, the trade-off here that is being made is the amount of money that's going out of the country sold for oil is actually going to be spent inside the country, generating jobs on not only the EV manufacturing, powertrain, and all of those aspects, but we'll also be spending it on electricity generation, and that includes RE and solar and all of the jobs that are created as part of that. So when we look at it from those point of view and all the benefits that are created, I think the number they had when we were looking at a 2030 30% scenario was that 1.2 lakh jobs are created in the EV powertrain and for generation of power, whereas there is a loss of 1.6 lakh jobs on the ICE manufacturing as well as oil industry. But again, the point is the savings that we are making from the money that is going outside the country, that gets spent again back inside the country, and that could go into all kinds of other jobs and supporting all kinds of other jobs. Secondly, the other gain is also that because the TCOs are going to be much better, there is savings on each and every household level, right? Whoever's driving the vehicle or using the vehicle, and that money also can go back into the economy for other kind of jobs. So I think that's where we need to look at it. There is it's not a direct benefit, but there may be a second a level and third level of jobs that are created as a result of the localization effect that is created. So I think, yeah, so it is most likely, I think once we look into more of the tertiary jobs, for example, that are created, it'll be clearer as to what occurs. But yeah, I think it's positive at this point.
Yes. You rightly said, Vivek. In fact, let me tell you, all the government initiatives, this employment thing comes as a core, Whenever I go, wherever I go, this is one of the first questions that is asked, that what implication will it have on the employment? So it has got to be positive, at least in the long run, it has got to be positive. Because for a country like India, you cannot set it aside and think of something else. But we mentioned about last mile mobility, last mile connectivity. Yes, that is one of the most significant, both for the passenger as well as the freight sector. And that ought to be decarbonized. First, it has to be laid down very clearly and it has to be decarbonized. Tell me, ma'am, what prescriptions would you have for this particular area of mobility, that is last mile connectivity, last mile mobility?
Yes, so as you said, for me, this is one of the most important aspects. What can be done? I think a couple of points there. So we have been, in the recent budget also, we have made a lot of announcements about funding metro systems. But we've had this long discussion with the ministry and people who make metro that making accessible stations, access to metro is not capital intensive. It's a fraction of their total budget. Then why doesn't it happen? It can easily be part of that. So what I have been explained every time, including my Mr. Sridharan, that, roads belong to, the jurisdiction is different. And earlier the attitude was, my job is to make the tunnels run the trains. I'm not really bothered about the access part. So my recommendation is, we need to have not a metro policy just to fund it, but we need to have a public transport policy so that the jurisdictional issues and financing issues, both for buses and for non-motorized infrastructure, which is pedestrian and bicycles, is inclusive of that. Otherwise, we are not able to do it because alone, this access infrastructure is not a bankable project.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So what you say is that there ought to be synergy among the policies and it has to be looked in a holistic manner.
Yeah.
Over to you, Clay, on the same topic. Yes, I know zero pollution delivery campaign is one of the closest to your heart. But yes, tell me, last mile connectivity, how to go about it, and what are the challenges, and what does hold us?
So on passenger, I totally agree with Geetam, ma'am. It has access and safety in accessing public transport hubs has to be a priority. I think that final mile is oftentimes walked, and if it's not a bankable project, but it needs to be invested in because of the actual system benefit it provides. But to your point, sir, on final mile delivery, we've looked at this topic quite extensively. Final mile delivery in India accounts for a disproportionate amount of cost and pollution. And the companies that are behind a lot of it, the rise in e-commerce has been staggering around the world, particularly in India. The e-commerce companies, the global e-commerce companies and the e-commerce companies in India have strong enough balance sheets that we should be making a serious push to electrify all final mile delivery in the country. I think this can be done in a campaign approach, like Mr. Sinha just mentioned, a zero pollution delivery campaign. And we should reward the companies that are doing this with recognition for their good behavior, for their, for ultimately making business sense decisions. And one of the things that RMI is exploring along with Niti Aayog is what would it look like to actually certify those deliveries as zero pollution, as zero emission, in the same way that organic food or Forest Stewardship Council wood is certified. We actually think those parcels brought to your home when they're delivered by a zero emission vehicle should be certified as such. Let the consumer know. It's a nice way to actually reach the consumer and to give the consumer who perhaps can't afford an electric vehicle at this time or even an electric two-wheeler, give them an opportunity to participate directly in the market as it's transforming. So I see this as a first moving segment and one we should all be pushing and encouraging as quickly as we can to achieve that 100% mark. This is the first one that can move.
Okay, thank you. And over to you, Vivek, on the same topic.
Thank you, sir. I think I would concur completely with Geeta ma'am on the last mile connectivity and first mile for passenger, because I think we somehow seem to imagine that also needs to be mechanized, whereas it can simply be walk and cycle and that's the end of it. And to an extent, it's not just infrastructure. I want to add to that point, it's not just better non-motorized transport infrastructure, safer infrastructure on streets, but it's also just better urban planning. We have just created road networks that are separate from each other, going from one neighborhood to another. You probably have to go back to the main road, main streets, and then go back in. These disconnected networks are not helping encourage non-motorized transport. And we will need to also make sure that the cities that we build going forward don't have disconnected networks and perhaps also don't have all of these large gated communities that we have now a fascination for in the country. So we need to find some ways out of those problems. But also, if you were to just look at the mechanized modes, we do see that e-rickshaws have, to a large extent, started to provide that service in many parts of Delhi, and a lot of the cities, even in the Gangetic Plain, I think plenty of cities have e-rickshaws as one of the main modes of transport. I think it's interesting to look at freight, because it is also, I think we just did a study with Terry that just completed, which showed a lot of results in many different types of freight mobility. And I think the challenge that we see is that there is the ownership model, because when drivers are owners, then I think, like what Clay was saying, the financing kicks in, and the larger capital cost to start with is just the biggest barrier. So while we see a lot of network companies and aggregators coming into freight, we will have to look at how innovative financing models could be created, and how some of these companies could actually enable their drivers to switch to electric in case they continue to have an aggregator driver model. But I think the number of cases in which freight electrification has occurred in most of the cities, you see freight has already started to get electrified, and that's a very, very promising start for us.
Yes, very well said, Vivek. In fact, last mile connectivity is again on the high priority of the government, and it's a really challenging task because it amounts to, it starts from first evacuation of at the terminal itself. The terminal has to be very fluid, and the connectivity is to be decided by so many factors. For example, in the urban areas, the alignment, I mean, it is already laid down. Everything is laid down. So in that laid down structure, you have to plan that how exactly that last mile can be, the inclusion can be achieved. So that becomes really, really challenging. Till now, we have been talking about the surface transport only, precisely railways and roadways. Now, what role could and how to go about this decarbonizing airways and as well as shipping lines, our waterways? Over to you, Geeta ma'am.
I don't really work in this area very much. However, for airways, I think it's the technology, mostly the fuel and more efficient aircraft engines. I think that is where the papers, the studies that I have seen, that is where they are showing the maximum benefit.
And yes, Clay?
Similarly, it's not a core area of focus for my research, but I was encouraged to see that United Airlines just made a net zero carbon by 2050 pledge. That means, they're staking the reputation of their company publicly against the technology improvements that Professor Geetam was just describing. I think that's primarily driven by aircraft efficiency, by biofuels, and by carbon sequestration programs. That's their approach to achieving net zero by 2050. I will say it's one of the areas where I think hydrogen can be an interesting application, is in air travel in the future. Obviously, there are some safety concerns and developments that need to take place. But as it relates to waterways, I think battery technology and battery energy density is developing sufficiently that it's not out of the question that we'll see battery operated water shipping in our lifetime.
Yes, Vivek?
Yeah, I guess there's not much to add to what has been said already. Biofuels, certainly, if we were to go down the path of creating more biofuels, even in the country, I think we will need to start prioritizing them for use in airways. I think that's probably where we will reap most benefits. Hydrogen does look promising. I think, if I'm not wrong, Boeing had just started looking at experimenting at hydrogen in use in their aircraft. So I guess it's early days, but yeah, I think it's also challenging it is a challenging area. So we don't know how the technology is going to pan out. But that's perhaps where we need to start betting on our mode shift strategies as well, as far as we can. To ensure that some of these long distance transport can be shifted to safer, cleaner modes of transport right now.
Okay, thank you. Now let me take some of the questions that are being raised by the audience. One question is that what are the key challenges? Geeta ma'am, this is over to you. What are the key challenges in the infrastructure creation for non-motorized transport and how they can be bridged?
So, as I said in the beginning, actually, the creation of non-motorized transport design is not a challenge. There are a lot of small pilots done here and there where it shows it's feasible in our current road network. The key challenges is acceptance by the people who make decisions in terms of investments and in terms of actually working on the ground. Because that is where we find again and again major barriers. And our recent experience of working in small cities, so for last few years we've been working in small cities like Bulandshahr and Patiala, which is, there are more than 300, 400 cities of this size. So if we show success here, the possibility of replication is very high. What key challenge we found here is uh, very deficient local capacity, both in terms of expertise of actually implementing things on the ground. But I thought, our barrier was also discussing with the important decision makers. Because in one of the cities, within 3 years, we were dealing with the fourth district magistrate. So, these kind of issues we are still struggling. And after spending more than few thousand man hours in these small cities, I would say that we still face major challenge in actually preparing a roadmap that in next 5 years, how much NMT infrastructure you could achieve. So I would say it is not about money. It is not about actual designs. It's about a lot of hand holding needs to be done after target setting, and not lot of hand holding for field staff and for planners and for decision makers in our situation.
I'll tend to completely disagree with what you are saying, ma'am, because the design for the motorized and the non-motorized transport is altogether different. And on those networks where they are a shared motorized and they have to share it, there also the designs are altogether different. And probably the best examples come from European or maybe American systems. Yes, over to you, Clay. What are the challenges in the infrastructure creation for non-motorized?
I'll come back to that later because again I disagree with you. But
yes,
let's hear from others first.
Yes, Clay. Over to you, Clay.
I'd surrender the floor back to Professor Geetam if the debate is live. I don't want to get in the way.
Okay. Yes, Vivek.
Should we wait till Geetam ma'am finishes? I'm not sure.
No. You please.
Maybe.
I will always.
I think I'm going to speak probably for her because I think I agree largely to a point that we know of how we have standards on how to build roads and safely build roads and streets and footpaths and cycle tracks. It is not something that we really. It is not the gap that is the challenge. Of that knowledge is not the gap that we have. It's really the troubles in execution that causes these problems. I think what ma'am was saying in terms of when leadership changes, the whole logic of the project itself just goes with that person who was working on it. You need a lot of build up and education that is required around the stakeholders involved. And so when people move, when key stakeholders changes happen, it becomes very difficult to keep the project moving. It's also, I think, important that when you look at non-motorized transport infrastructure in cities, there is actually quite a lack of any kind of standards and processes in place, which policymakers and people in decision making can, rely on and say, okay, this is what the document says. Okay, let me just go ahead and do it the way it is said, right? And that's that crutch that they can use and fall back on, and not have to use their own minds and logic to kind of try and figure things out every time. That's missing. And so it becomes difficult for people to come in and take over such projects. So I think standards, guidelines, and the ability to deal with stakeholders. Just to look at how do you converse with a shopkeeper and tell them that, look, we're going to increase the size of the side of your sidewalk and perhaps remove parking as a result. that's a difficult conversation to have. And do our governments have that capability at this point, the city governments? Not necessarily. And so we do see those cities under the smart city, we see a lot of these experiments and we've seen a lot of success. And one of the important things where success is seen is that they're willing to work with stakeholders. And then take everyone along the process of building this infrastructure. So I do think that ecosystem needs to be built. Good amount of standards and good amount of stakeholder interaction.
Yes, ma'am. You wanted to disagree, please go ahead.
No, partly I think Vivek answered. He exactly said what I was wanting to say. That this is what the experience has been, that actually we do have very good standards now. And let me share with you a very good example from Delhi itself. UTPEC, within Delhi Development Authority, United Traffic Transport Planning and Engineering Cell came up, and they came up with a very, very detailed guidance on how the roads should be done, which becomes, and actually for all different right-of-ways in Delhi, they showed how you can make an arterial road, you can create a bicycle lane, you can create pedestrian safe paths, etc. But now we find that the PWD in Delhi and Municipal Corporation in Delhi, they themselves are not following that guideline, which is there. It is with them. And when it was developed, it was with the lot of discussion with all these stakeholders. So this is, I think, the part that, we need very serious commitment. And these guidelines are not, they have not been copied from European cities. There is a lot of work behind it. So UTPEC is only one example. Now you start finding in many other cities also, these kind of documents are coming and they are being developed with a lot of stakeholder discussion, but execution part and implementation. So again, we go back to traffic police or the new, the district magistrate, and they start asking the first question that the biggest problem is to provide more parking. So, there is that part is still quite weak. So, as Vivek was saying, that we need to have a lot of, probably discussion and preparing all different stakeholders why this is important and how do we execute it.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Now I'll shift it a little on a different trajectory. Where do you see the role of solar amongst the renewables? How much will be the role of solar? Because that is where we are going in a big way. Role of solar in decarbonizing this transport and, well, our preparedness for that. Yes, Vivek?
Yeah, I think solar is a non-negotiable. It is a necessary condition to decarbonize our power infrastructure itself, and then as subsequently, because that's the power that EVs are going to use, and perhaps even hydrogen, right, through electrolysis. So it becomes, it's a non-negotiable. And to an extent, again, I think I did allude to some of the trends recently. If you look at the SECI bid for solar plus storage that came out a few months ago, 1.9 rupees is just incredibly low. And that's a great start. And if that is a trend of what's to come in the future, there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to do solar, because the real trouble with solar was the ability to store it and use it at a later point. And if we can, if that one piece can be taken care of, I think we will be good.
Yes, over to you, Clay, on the same topic. On the same issue, rather?
Yeah, thank you. Vivek and I's colleagues over at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in California, I think, put this quite nicely, where they say that, 2 to 3 rupee per unit solar PPAs being signed today can actually serve as 25-year inflation-proof fuel for electric vehicles. And if you look at the volatility that exists with diesel and with petrol, that stability and inflation-proofness is actually worth a lot in and of itself despite its low, in addition to its extremely low cost. So if you look at use cases like trucks, for example, many of which operate in the night, as the technology for electric trucks comes online, and we think about daytime peak coincident solar charging, then you can, by signing these very low cost 20+ year PPAs and committing to a pathway where we electrify, via trucks in India, MDVs and HDVs, then you're actually securing and locking in inflation-proof 25-year fuel contracts at unbelievably low costs. That's the type of synergy where I think a ton of opportunity exists.
So, yes, you rightly said about the solar energy, the renewables. Ma'am, role of solar in decarbonizing
similar, I think, yes, I also think that, major role is in producing clean electricity, which is the fuel part. I think our preparedness for HDV switching to this is little low right now, so we need to pay attention there. And my third point would be that, but however, this is only addressing 49% of our total emissions from the sector. So we still need to worry about the other aspects.
Yes, but then that would require a lot of storage systems to be available.
Yeah.
That has to be kind of Make in India kind of initiatives have to be there. Yes. Now, there is another question that is with regard to micromobility. We have already touched. Yes, there is another question about airways. Airways we have touched. E-vehicles in logistics, in tackling the menace of emission. E-vehicles, of course, the obvious reply could be that it is zero tailpipe emission standards are there. So it is able to do it. So after so much of conversation on the topic, let's see where do we stand now. Yes, ma'am, starting from you. At least you will agree with me that there is a greater sensitivity in all areas in all spheres of public, whether it is a policymaker, academics, industry, whatever it is. There is a greater sensitivity that the kind of technology, the kind of transport systems that we should have, it has got to be clean, it has got to be cutting edge, it has to be charged. That sort of sensitivity is definitely coming in. And policies are being guided towards that. One can always accept that there are innumerable challenges and some gaps could be there. Yes. But then let's see where do we stand now, ma'am.
You summarized it nicely, but I would like to point out one major gap that we have not discussed, which is that when we are looking at transport, it is not just about decarbonization. I think integrating with other SDG goals is equally important. So we are looking at, local benefits, health benefits, and I think we have to play the complete thing in that context. So that becomes extremely important. Otherwise, we will end up with lots of electric cars, and that will not be very good for our health. Even electric car does not have positive health impacts because of lack of active transport. So I think that aspect also we should look into.
Yes, so it has to be looked holistically, all the complete synergy has to be there. Yes, you rightly put it. Clay on electric vehicles, electric cars. Ma'am says that it can have very negative health externalities.
That's not the science that I'm aware of. I think the zero pollution, the zero tailpipe aspects of EVs make them inherently cleaner, quieter, and offer a better driver experience. So, I think there is a staged approach that is logical for India or for any country that's looking to make this transition in terms of prioritizing segments based on their equity, based on their market readiness, based on their impact in terms of the metrics that matter most to the country. And so I think that type of staging and sequencing makes sense. I think that also advanced planning in terms of understanding now what a future looks like in 5 years or 7 years when you have large stocks of batteries that are becoming retired. What does that mean in terms of advanced resource recovery out of the batteries so that India can actually build a domestic reserve from a recycling point of view? Or secondly, what do the secondary life or applications look like for those batteries as an the additional value add for enabling integration of renewables? I think both are big opportunities. I think safety is a top concern, but if planned for and managed correctly, I don't think that it's a barrier that we're seeing manifest anywhere else in the world.
Okay, Vivek, I think you can reconcile these two positions. Both of them are experts in urban mobility, you see. But one says that this is the science, and other one says this science I'm not aware of. Please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. That's a difficult question that you're posing to me.
Now, this time you have to take a position. You can't be always saying that this way or that way.
So I'll probably go back to how I started the first question that you asked me, right? We will have to straddle a mode shift strategy as well as an improved vehicle strategy. That is the only way we're going to be able to decarbonize. I think that ability to, with the mode shift strategies, because they align so very well with our sustainable development goals, it is something that is, again, a fail-safe, just in case we are unable to completely switch, just in case we are unable to completely decarbonize our power supply. All of this, the mode shift and strategies, and because they can reduce demand, become important. And so even if we miss our mark in 2050, we don't miss it by too much. And that's an important way of looking at the entire mode shift and the void shift kind of strategies. While I think I agree with Clay, when we look at electric vehicles, there is certainly no reason. Of course, it doesn't provide active transport and the health benefits of active transport, but certainly they avoid emissions, they avoid local air pollution, they make air cleaner for people who are exposed to traffic on a day-to-day basis, and there are benefits to be gained from that as well, and there are very huge benefits to be gained from the community and from urban areas where people are concentrated and the emissions are high, Delhi being a great case of one of them. So, and most cities have poor air quality. There's nobody's questioning that in India, we have several cities with poor air quality, and transport is a great source of that pollution. So there are benefits of going electric beyond just the decarbonization aspect of it.
So may I come in here for a short,
yes,
intervention?
Yes, ma'am, very much. I'm inviting you to that.
Okay.
You know, the prof always has to, has to have the last word.
No such thing.
if the prof happens to be a woman, it has to be final word. It is
I just wanted to qualify that I do not disagree with Clay or Vivek in terms of emission benefits coming from electric vehicles. But what I was alluding to, that of course it is better than vehicles which are running on any other fossil fuel. However, the current health studies show that lack of active transport, which means just normal walking, commuting, and bicycling, gives you, if you do not have that enough, you just look at WHO studies and plus other studies coming out, it leads to cardiovascular diseases, it leads to dementia, it leads to a whole lot of, India is becoming the diabetes capital of the world now. So it is the people becoming dependent on motorized transport. That is where the problem arises. So that is why my take is, of course, we need EVs because they are cleaner than other fossil fuel based vehicles. However, to get the complete benefits, and we talked about SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which is addressing all kinds of health issues, children walking to school, etc., etc., that we have to recognize, and that is where a lot of emphasis has to be on. We will not get our modal shifts without paying emphasis on that. So that is what I was saying, that let's look EV in this whole context. So I'm not disagreeing with the science of, EVs producing less emissions.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So now I think it was a wonderful discussion that we have on the issue of decarbonizing transport, and we almost touched all the aspects. We started with a kind of agreement to disagree, and we agreed and we disagreed, and finally we come to a point where all of us agree that with the growing sensitivity, growing awareness about this thing, things will be improving in a big way. Whether it is the entire ecosystem has to be addressed, it can't be one way. You rightly said, of course, wherever a policymaker is there, I mean, somebody from the government is there, he is the first one to be always held responsible for whatever goes on. But in government also, tremendous efforts are, the entire government approach is like that, that we are making all efforts to ensure that what we call the ease of living and the ease of doing business, ease of living, finally it comes to us. That is why we see that, these are the kind of questions, most of the apprehensions that you have laid, ma'am, these are the kind of questions that we are asked on anything that we tend to initiate, we go ahead with. These are the issues, these are the concerns of the government. And that is why I must emphatically, though it is not a part of this thing, but I must tell you that the entire system of governance is geared towards ensuring that the kind of technology, the kind of cutting edge technology, the best in the class is brought to us, to the country, and the kind of mobility specifically that we go in for, it has to be transformative, it has to be cutting edge, it has to be shared. And of course, last mile connectivity, that is most important, that's most clear, that is very high on agenda to which the entire government and its system is committed to. There could be one-offs that one can always discount for. Now over to you, Sharif. Now it's your time to take it forward.
Thank you so much, sir, for conducting a very fascinating and lively discussion, I would say, and always learning a lot from these discussions. The broader picture that we are looking at in terms of climate change and the topics that we are discussing on this through this conference and summit is about climate change and the kind of devastation it is causing in our lives, especially in the recent times that we have witnessed the Uttarakhand devastation very recently last weekend. And, we might not be left with any other option but to say yes to the question where we talked about is decarbonizing transport is possible or not. With that, I thank all the speakers. I take this opportunity to kind of, highlight one information to the speakers as well as the larger audience is that we are conducting a workshop on how electric traction technology could be useful in the heavy duty vehicles and to decarbonize that. That is happening next week on February 18. Details will be there online as well. But with that, I thank everyone and thank Clay, Professor Geetam Tiwari, Vivek, and Sinha sir. And have a good day and good evening to all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.